Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Living in Faith Everyday podcast. My name is Jeremy McCandless, and this is the Life Podcast. You know, in the Christian life, there are two types of Christian experience. How can you tell which one you are experiencing, and how can you tell if that one is the complete Christian experience? Well, for an insight into this area, I'm going to suggest that we take a look at these couple of verses from the book of James, because there appear to be right from the off two types of religious faith being described in this passage. The first is what is described in a weak and worthless sort of Christianity, and the second is a pure spiritual life, an empowered and enriching Christian life, and we're going to look at both of those today. Right from the off, it says this. These are the scriptures. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. You know, many times in my young life when I was growing up, my mother would ask me to go to the corner shop for her. Usually she'd send me to get something specific, and too often I would return with something not quite so specific, sometimes not even the right thing at all. For example, she once said to me, "Go to the shops and get me a pot of whipping cream." And I returned with single cream. I hadn't noticed I'd brought the wrong thing. And I remember saying, "Well, it doesn't really matter, does it?" My mother said, "Well, it's not going to do what I needed to do." "It'll be fine," I said. "It's all cream anyway." So this is what she did. She gave me a whisk, she gave me the cream, and she said, "Go away and keep whisking that cream until it's thick enough that you can bring it back to me, and I can test if it's thick enough by turning the bowl upside down above your head, and hopefully none of the cream will fall out." Well, I'm sure you can guess how that experiment ended. You see, when it comes to cream for whipping, then it seems that only whipping cream is the real deal. You see, there's such a thing as single cream, and there's such a thing as whipping cream. They are all cream, but they won't do the same thing for you. Only one of them will deliver. Only one of them is the real deal. Can you see where I'm going with this? In the Christian life, there are two main types of Christian experience, I believe. And I believe that's what this passage is telling us about. So what I'd like to ask us is, how can we tell which type of Christian life that we are we experiencing? Do we have a sort of low-fat Christian life? Do we have a sort of Christianity light? Or are you having the full fat experience? Are you experiencing the real deal when it comes to your Christian faith? Isn't it great that this morning, for once in your life, you're going to be encouraged to go for the full fat option? For an insight into this area, can I suggest we look again at these two verses in James, beginning with verse 26, where it says, "Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongue deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless." So right from the off, there are two types of religious faith being described in this passage. The first is described as a worthless sort of Christianity, and the second is a pure spiritual life, a full fat, the real deal, so to speak, and we're going to talk about both of those today. But let me begin by talking about what it means to be deceived. How does that happen? Well, look again at verse 26, where it says, "Those who consider themselves religious." The key word here is consider themselves religious. Consider. But as the passage goes on to tell us, such people are in fact deceived. What is it you think that makes people consider themselves to be religious when they're not in fact living in the will of God? I think the clue is in the use of the word religious. Now, people today use that word all the time, don't they? But do you know the Bible hardly ever uses that term to describe the Christian faith, and when it does, it's usually doing it in a negative way. That particular word religious focuses on the rituals of religion, the rites, the rites of religious faith, the external appearance of a religion, and I think that's a very strong clue to what's going on here. James is talking about the person who goes through the external forms of religious practice without actually surrendering their life to the will of God. In other words, someone who's going through the external actions of appearing to be a person of faith, and by doing those things, they then consider themselves to be religious. Now, such people may be meticulous in the detail of their external religious practice. They may join in worship regularly. They may even put money in the offering bags. They might be even able to sit through a whole one of my sermons without falling to sleep. They effectively are able to go through all the outward processes, the rituals of religion. Such people may walk out of a building of a religious event and afterwards think, you know what, because I was there today, that means I was spiritual. But there's a warning being given here to us in all of this. I believe this passage warns us that even some really meaningful Christian practices can be turned into empty religious rituals if approached in the wrong way. Have you ever thought about the fact that even praying every day or reading your Bible can be ritualized if it's not approached in the right way? Let me be clear, neither of those activities are bad. In fact, I would highly recommend both of them. But anything, even going to church, can become just a ritual. And this becomes an issue, and it becomes a really significant issue when you think because you're doing these things, that's what makes you a Christian, that's what makes you a good, solid Christian. And that is what is getting at here, what it means. If you're doing that, then you're deceiving yourself. You deceive yourself when it comes to your spiritual life. But please note that James was not the first person in the Bible to point this out. An Old Testament prophet called Micah said something very similar hundreds of years previously when he said, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good." And here's the key. On what the Lord requires of you. He's shown you what is good and what the Lord requires of you. And it is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In the Old Testament, it was Micah's complaint that ritual sacrifices were in themselves useful if the people did not walk in justice, love, and kindness, and walk humbly before their God. All throughout history, it seems that people have tried to make ritual and liturgy a substitute for sacrifice and for service. Too many times, people are more keen on making religious life look magnificent within the church or the church building at the expense of neglecting making it something beautiful as it lives outside the church building. Just read the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, and you will see that he teaches over and over again the dangers of the external trappings of religion. Nearly all of his interactions with the Pharisees of his day dealt with that deception. Jesus warns us that having this ritualized approach to our faith not only is in danger of potentially making you a hypocrite, but it also means you literally could be deceiving yourselves. But thankfully, he then says, you know what, I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you a test. I'm going to give you a gauge against which you can measure your spiritual life to see, in fact, if you're being deceived, to see whether your faith is the real deal, or whether you're just going through the rituals, and whether you're just going through the rituals in such a way as you don't let the truth take root in your heart. James says, I'm going to pick one thing by which we can all measure our faith. Is it going to be our knowledge of theology? Is it going to be our knowledge of the Bible? Is it going to be the good works you do for charity? No. He picks just one thing and he tells us what it is in verse 26 when he says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves and their religion is worthless. James says the test you need to take in order to see if you're experiencing the real deal when it comes to your Christian faith is the tongue test. Isn't it interesting? A doctor will ask you to stick out your tongue to determine the physical state of your body, but here the Bible is telling us we need to pay attention to our tongues if we want to determine the spiritual state of our souls. And we're told here that's the measure we should use, and if we're failing that measure, then we're being deceived about the genuineness of our Christian faith. This is very powerful stuff. It doesn't mince its words. Not only deceived, it tells us that your religious faith is in fact useless. The writer's not mincing his words here. In the modern context, I believe James is teaching it's okay for you to go in church and pray and read your Bible and do all those things. However, if you're doing those things in order to think you're religious and you're doing them in such a way that doesn't change what comes out of your mouth, that's the measure to use, then your faith is being seen to be worthless. Very straightforward example. If you go to church and you hear all about love, and then you walk out of the church building and you don't do loving things, you don't say loving things, then what value has that teaching had? It's been useless, worthless, which means your faith in its practical outworking is worthless because it hasn't even begun to affect the way you talk. Later on in chapter 3, we're going to be told in no uncertain terms how we must learn to control our tongues. We're going to be told we have to tame our tongues. Because if all you're doing is attending and you're not putting into practice what's said, if all you're doing is the religious stuff and you can't even control your tongue, then he says, you know what? Your religion is worthless. If you think that you're holy or got it sus because of your religious life, well, my friends, it tells us here you're in trouble. It's telling us it's possible to live an entirely deceived spiritual life. Let me illustrate. If you went to the doctor for a physical examination, or he or she said to you, you know what, you're sick, and they explain to you what's caused your symptoms, and they explain to you what the disease is you're suffering from, and then they write you a prescription, and you go to the chemist and you buy the tablets that you need, and you set them on the kitchen table, but you don't take them, what good will that do? But imagine then you start telling everybody, you know what, I'm in good shape now because I went to the doctor and the doctor told me exactly what's wrong with me, and they even gave me a prescription for medicine that is the absolute cure for everything that's wrong with me and will make me well. And you say, and by the way, I'm not actually taking the tablets, but I feel I'm in really good shape now because I know what the problem is and I've been to the doctor. In a sense, that's what religious people do. But sometimes they can even go a stage further than this. They can be in that situation and then they begin to look at other people and say, look how sick these other people are. Look at me, I'm in so much better condition. I'm in a better condition because I've been to the doctor. I'm in better shape. And they think they can begin to tell everybody else and they know, because they know exactly what they need to do to get better and what they need to do to get better. In fact, they begin to feel they can explain to other people what's wrong with them. Look at me, they say. I know what my problem is. I'm proud of what I've done. I've been to the doctor. And you know what? He gave me a prescription and I paid for my own prescription. I've been to the doctor. I've had the diagnosis. Bought the pills, I paid for them, they're sitting on the kitchen table at home. Look at how well I am now. But hold on a moment, isn't that person still sick? That in a sense is what this passage is saying. If you think you're in spiritual good shape just because you went to church and listened to what is said, then you may well still be deceived. If you think you are spiritually well just because you put money in an offering, then you may well be spiritually sick. Because if you don't do something with what you learn, then you still stay in the same spiritual state. If Christianity is not having a practical effect on your everyday life, then my friends, you may very well be deceived. And James helpfully is telling us the best measure of knowing, because we're all blind to this to a degree, but the best measure of knowing how you're doing in this regard is very straightforward. It's how well you are able to control your tongue. Because if you're not able to do that, then you need to look closely, friends, and ask yourself the question, is the version of Christianity I'm living the real deal? So what does the real deal look like? Well, for one thing, it's obviously going to help you control your tongue, but it's also going to be manifest in another way, which says religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphan widows in their distress and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So what does a pure and faultless religion look like? Well, perhaps it's something like the type of person who looks after widows and orphans in their distress, it says here, and keeps themselves from being polluted by the world. Now, this term widows and orphans is interesting because it's what theologians and Bible experts call a proverbial expression. In other words, it doesn't just mean widows and orphans. It's a phrase that is meant to take as representing anybody in need. Now, this first century example of widows and orphans, I think, tells us an important thing. It tells us that the type of people that you're encouraged to go and help are the very type of people who will not be able to pay you back. So what James is saying, go minister to somebody, but don't expect anything back in return. So we are to go minister, but there's a second thing we are also told to do, which is to keep ourselves from being polluted by the world. So what does that mean? Well, on a straightforward level, the sole objective of the devil is to get you to live your life, but to live it in such a way that you leave God out of it. Satan thinks it's okay if you do morally good things, as long as you're leaving God out of it. Have you ever thought about the fact that Satan doesn't mind even if you do religious stuff, as long as you do it in such a way as it leaves God out? But James is saying the real deal, the real version of Christian faith means it's not polluted by the world, by leaving God out of the ministry we do for others. And it's not polluted because by doing good, well, if we do good and we take God out of it, then we, by nature, are taking credit for it. It's really, really easy to leave God out of your life. We know we can leave him out of our day-to-day activities. That's easy enough. We know we can leave God out of our decision-making. But this warning here, and what this warns us, is that we can even leave God out of our church life and our ministry. The text is telling us that if we have the real deal, the real faith, pure religion, as James calls it, then very straightforwardly we are to hold our tongue, but we are to go and help people. And when we do that, we are to credit the Lord in our doing of it. The text is telling us if you have real faith, pure religion, that's what you do. You can do those things in any order you like. Just include the Lord in everything you do. And as much as possible, try and keep your mouth shut, except in expressing love, and go and love somebody. Remember last time it was put very clearly for us. Don't just hear the word it says, but do it. And doing it, you know what? Doing it, living it, is often just going and finding somebody to love. You may remember at the start of this chapter, right back at the beginning of this series of studies, we were told to count it all pure joy when we went through difficult times. Now at the end of the chapter, he's saying to us, Take what you've learned through those difficult times and go and visit those who are struggling. Go and visit those who are going through trials at the moment and show them what you have learned through the difficult times you've been through. And by doing that, you are truly loving them, and you are truly loving God, and you are truly serving God. If you've got a problem, learn from it and go and help someone else. You see, our human nature is when we have a problem is we can tend to turn inwards, perhaps even use that as problem as an excuse to stop helping others, perhaps even in the worst scenario, blame God. However, this passage suggests to me that if you have a problem, then one of the very best things you can do is go find someone else with a similar problem and support them. Let me end by telling you a story. I can't personally confirm its accuracy, but it makes a very powerful point. It was told by a lady called Miss Jean Thompson, a retired fourth grade primary teacher, a spinster who never married, never had children, and whose story was told and printed in the form of a letter that she wrote to Home Life magazine in America in 1976. And she said this: "Primary school teachers," she said, "are meant to treat all children the same. But sadly for me, that wasn't always the case. Particularly in the case of one boy who joined my class in September from another school. He was particularly badly behaved, he was disruptive, aggressive, and he always smelled and needed the bath. He was surly, rude, uninterested, and didn't perform well in tests. I probably took too much pride in marking his mistakes with a red pen, and maybe even put a particularly large F for fail at the top of his work sometimes." That December, she was doing her first end-of-term assessment for Theodore, or Teddy as he was called. "Before completing his report," she writes, "I decided to open the year-end report sent to her by his first, second, and third year teachers from the previous school. His Year 1 report said this: Teddy is an excellent student, happy and fun, always willing to learn and be helpful. He is bright, inquisitive, has a ready laugh and tries hard, and is a joy to be around." That confused Jean somewhere. She continues. His Year 2 teacher said this: "Teddy is an excellent student, well liked by his classmates, but he is troubled because his mother has a terminal illness, and life is a real struggle at home. He is finding it hard to concentrate, and his work and his relationship with some of his friends has suffered." His third grade teacher wrote this about him in her year-end report: "Teddy sometimes tries to work hard, but his mother's death has been hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father is not coping and doesn't support him. Teddy has become withdrawn and often sleeps in class. I fear his schooling will continue to suffer badly unless some outside steps are taken." At the end of Christmas term in America, just like in the UK, children often give their teachers Christmas presents. Miss Thompson's letter continues. "I received 30 presents that year, all beautifully wrapped, apart from Teddy's, which was scrunched up in a brown paper bag. Inside it was a bottle of perfume with less than a quarter of the perfume left in it, and a broken bracelet with a couple of stones missing. I thanked him, dabbed a little perfume on my wrist, and said how pretty the bracelet was. As Teddy left that day, he said to Miss Thompson, 'You smell just like my mum used to.' That day," she said, "I went home and I cried for nearly an hour." Her letter then said, "I almost quit my job that day. However, I decided to quit teaching lessons and begin to really try and teach children instead." Jean Thompson spent the next years focusing on the children in her class individually, especially Teddy, and she noticed the more she encouraged him, the more he seemed to come to life. By September of the following year, Teddy's results had put him top in the top third of his class. 2 years later, he left primary school, and she got a note pushed under her door saying he was doing okay. Even though he was 2 years into his next school, he still said she was still his favourite teacher. She writes, I didn't hear from him for another 6 years. Then she said I got a letter posted this time saying he'd just graduated from high school, third in his class. 4 more years went by, and she got another letter saying he had battled through university, and although tough at times, he had graduated with what we would today call first. But you're still my favourite teacher, he added. 4 more years passed, and then another letter came. This time he said he'd carried on studying, and he was now qualified. The letter was signed Dr. Theodore Stoddard, MD. There came one final letter 4 more years after that. Theodore wrote to Jean Thompson saying that he'd met a girl and he was to be married. And he said his father had died some years ago, and he wondered if Miss Thompson would come to the service and sit in the place usually reserved for the mother of the groom. She went to the wedding, and guess what? She still wore the bracelet that he had given her 20 years earlier. Still with the missing stones, she just had the clasp ring. Sometimes discerning the will of God in any given situation is nothing more than discerning who God wants you to go and love. Go help somebody. Go love somebody.